He's Howard Eibach, a former copywriter and creative director and the author of 2 books on the creative brief.
And he's Henry Gomez, an ad agency strategist with over 26 years of experience. Together, we're the Brief Brothers. We love talking about creative briefs, briefing, and advertising. We're back with another episode, Henry. Today, we have an old friend of mine. His name is Mark Jenson. He's a lecturer with the University of Minnesota's Hubbard School of Journalism and Mass Communications. I talked to some of his classes. Let's join the conversation. Really delighted to introduce to our viewers, I guess I can say an old friend because I've known him since 2018. He's Mark Jenson. He's a lecturer at, and help me out if I get this wrong, Mark, you are with the University of Minnesota's Hubbard School of Mass Communications and Journalism, or is it the other way around?
Other way around, journalism, mass communication.
Okay, Hubbard School of Journalism and Mass Communications. And he teaches a couple of courses. I've talked to his students, I think for both courses, but mostly it's your creative, help me out again, creative development and strategy?
Advertising, strategy, and creative development. So kind of a class for sophomores and juniors.
Right. And he has been kind enough to use my books as required reading or recommended reading or both for both of these classes. So this is like a highlight of I guess twice a year I join his students, and Mark sends me a bunch of questions and I try to get through as many of them as I can. Sometimes I engage them in a little conversation, but mostly it's just plowing through their questions about advertising, creative. A lot of them think that I write briefs. I don't, but that's okay. That's okay. So anyway, I'm really delighted that Mark, that you could join us. This is about time because we really haven't talked as much as Henry and I would like to about what are the nuts and bolts challenges that you as an educator face in bringing up the next generation of creatives, of account people, of strategists, and so on. Plus, I think we also would love to talk to you about a little project that Henry and I just finished, which was inspired by you and your students by providing us with some ideas on a brand, and then we wrote a creative brief. So welcome to the Brief Brothers, Mark. We are so delighted to have you.
Well, I'm happy to be here, Howard. Good to see you again. Always happy to see you. And Henry, nice to finally meet you. I think I have watched at least 60-70% of the Brief Brothers, so I feel like I know your voice. It's in my head.
You're the one.
Yeah.
So let's start this conversation off, Mark, with some nuts and bolts. Henry and I have bemoaned the sad state of affairs in education for those of us who believe that it's so important to bring up the next generation, young people coming into the industry. What are some of the key challenges that you face? In fact, I went back and say, what were your expectations when you first started off as an educator at University of Minnesota's Hubbard School? And how has that changed as you've gone through a number of semesters working with students? Did your ideas match up, or have things changed? What's going on there?
Yeah, I'll give you a little context of background. I was in the industry for 35 years. I also was an adjunct for 13 years. I took from 1991 to 2004, I took a 10-year period off as my kids were going through school, and came back and started full-time in 2018. And I think that what I have seen, our students today are better writers than they were 15, 20 years ago. And I think that just has to do with schools, hopefully getting better students. Doesn't mean that they're perfect at all, because writing I talk about it a lot. This is not English 101, everybody. We're doing advertising. So we might not write proper English. Just do it is probably not a great example of perfect English. And then they start to kind of understand that. But I think that's kind of the challenge is to make them think this is not an English literature exercise. And the development of creative briefs is one of the first things that we talk about in both the classes, and it's a challenge. I love to talk to them about when you look at your first assignment, and then we look at the end of the semester when you've written 3, 4, or 5 creative briefs. I want you to look at the briefs closely and look how far you've come. Because I think that's the thing is at first they're trying to be perfect, and they're trying to they put a lot more executional evidence into the brief, not thinking about we're trying to get people to get to that point. But I think the challenges are, certainly since I started, the explosion of different content pieces that they have to understand. That's what I love about teaching, is they help teach me what's current, what's new on TikTok, what's new on blank, all these different platforms. So it's both, it's rewarding for me to help teach them some basics, but they also ground me in what's going on today. So hopefully that gave you a little perspective on that question.
Yeah, definitely. Moving along in that, what would you say? Let me back up again. I always get ahead of myself.
Let me ask a question real quick.
Okay, go ahead.
Related to, so I taught an intro to strategy class at the University of Miami. I've on and off, like I've taught at the ad school. I taught a sports marketing class at FIU a long time ago when I had no business teaching anything. And so I taught this intro to advertising strategy class at the University of Miami in the fall of 2019. And, what became really painfully obvious to me was, I had a lot of students in the class that were taking the class as an elective. They were a communications major. A lot of them were like PR majors. Yeah. Not a lot of them were necessarily advertising majors. And so they're in the School of Communication, and they didn't have a lot of business background. And our industry is, especially if you're talking about strategy and writing briefs, and you really have to be, knowledgeable at some degree about like how big business in America operates. And so like, their eyes were like the size of saucers when I would tell them things about like, you got to dig into the annual reports of the company that you're working on. And you got to know, like, how does this industry work? Like, I remember one of the teams in the class was doing Netflix, which is, I guess, appropriate that one of your class recommended we do Hulu. But it's like, you got to know this business, it's a subscriber based business, which has its challenges. There's churn, there's cost of acquisition. You're not just going to come in, with a parachute on and land and say, oh, I'm going to write your creative brief without, truly deeply understanding the business. And have you noticed that? And I wonder if it isn't a mistake really to let kids graduate with communications degrees in PR and advertising without some sort of, core 3 or 4 classes in business administration.
Yeah, it's a very valid point, Henry, and understanding a business problem, understanding how a business operates is critical. And we talk a lot about that in my classes, but it's not the semester long focus, of course, but it's the first thing that you've got to do when you start to work on a creative brief is, what is the challenge? What's the opportunity? I require that they have at least 5 reference points. That means, kind of like you did on the first episode, you went through all the different elements of how Hulu could work. And it's the same type of principle. I want them to read. I don't care what the 5 are, but I want you to start to ground yourself before you start writing who's the target audience, what's the insight. You got to have a basic business understanding. But absolutely, it's critical for students to have that basic understanding of business. And right now, I don't know if a lot of schools are doing that. I mean, specifically our school, we do not have a component of business classes like that. We have a lot more introductory classes. And then in some of the classes that I teach, the skills classes, that's where they're starting to get it, but they don't have like a semester long evidence.
Because even if you were going into the creative side, the art direction, the copywriting end of it, it would be incredibly valuable, right? Like we talked in the last couple of episodes, the best creatives were the ones that at heart were strategists too, because they had, the big Bill Burnett was a brilliant creative, but he was a brilliant business person. And that combination is very rare. And so I think that, bringing that side out in creative types would help the industry dramatically. And I think we would maybe have less of a mismatch in expectations between agencies and their creatives and what clients are looking for in terms of solutions to their business problems. And I say that fully cognizant of the fact that communications only can solve certain types of business problems, right? Like, and that's, but to me, it's an important thing when we're teaching students is like, first you need to understand the business and the business problem. And then maybe we can figure out if there's a communication problem or if there's something that we can alleviate in the business problem through communications. Because if it's a product design problem, if it's a, distribution problem, that's not something that communications is likely to help. But it can help if you make a change to distribution or some communications can help people know what's going on and things like that. So I just think that we've kind of, through specialization, we've kind of lost our way a little bit.
Yeah, it's a very valid point. In one of my classes, that's one of the things that we talk about is not every problem is going to be solved by an advertising issue. It's just not always going to be there. So that's the first thing that you have to identify is the issue that we're trying to really address a communication issue. And I tend to be more on that because we're in that type of a class, but we talk about those things definitely. And I think the other thing, Howard, Henry, you talked about was good creative people are good business people. I can tell you as an account person, the best creative people I worked with were unbelievably business savvy. Their acumen for business was tremendous. And it helped sell the work because they understood what the business was. And it's so critical, so critical.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things we've talked about, not an awful lot, but it would be a valuable exercise for anyone, student or a veteran alike, to write a creative brief that just solves a business problem. It's not a communication is going to come out of it, but just it's a business problem, and how do we solve it using the brief?
Yeah.
But that also brings me to another point, and that is, and I encounter this a lot in my training. I wonder if you encounter this when you're teaching, and that is the best creative briefs, and even the one that we wrote for Hulu is, although Henry does have some background on the brand on this, but the best briefs that I've come across don't spend any time explaining the brand. Because it's assumed that you know the brand.
Yeah.
Now, if you're reading in a freelance team, you've got to download them on the brand. But a lot of marketing folks who look at the briefs that I use for training and we dissect them, they say, "Well, this brief doesn't say anything about why this brand is great." And I said, "Well, it's not designed to, because this count has been with that agency for 20 years. We know the brand. This is a problem identified by the objective of the project. You're expected to know the brand." So when you're teaching students how to write a brief, do they feel it's necessary to have a whole page or a paragraph or a couple of lines of explaining the brand? Is that something that they feel compelled to write about?
No, we don't do that, Howard. We don't. The brief form that I have there might be a few sentences, and it's more about what's the problem or what's the opportunity. And that backgrounding piece, when I have them have at least 5 or 6 references, that's the point where we want them to kind of get up to speed on what's going on with the brand. But we don't bring in, we're not putting a brand brief into the creative brief, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
So one of my mentors in the business had come up through the Y&R network, and she provided me then, and I was a young, like, self-taught strategist, and they had basically 4 documents, and one was the creative brief, the other was a brand brief, right? And I found, though, just analyzing the documents and the questions asked in the documents extremely educational, to the point, 15 years later, I'm here telling you about it. But because I think that a lot of times, it's that whole thing, when you assume, you make an ass out of you and me, right? And just because you have an account for a long time doesn't mean that the people necessarily get it, like that they don't get what the client's trying to do, what the brand is trying to do. And to me, it's always important to make sure that we're all on the same at the same level in terms of understanding what the brand is. Plus, there's a very practical point of what Howard mentioned, which is, I can't always assume that I'm going to have a creative team that has a ton of experience with this brand. Might be a new employee, might be a freelance team that we bring in. And as the brief writer or the strategist, it's my job to kind of provide that background and that, institutional knowledge or history to not with to overburden them, but with enough information so that they can look at this assignment and not, miss simply because they don't understand the brand or what it's about.
Okay, I'm going to jump in. I'm going to jump in with a question that I've asked your students once or twice. You may remember. You may know where I'm going with this.
I know exactly where you're going.
Yeah,
with this.
And this is a new question that I was asking your students, and Henry and I talked about this a little bit. And then I asked them if they call themselves or believe themselves to be capitalists, because the nature of what we do in the advertising agency or on the client side is to be a major cog in the entire industry of capitalism. That we support the companies that make the things, that sell things, that provide incomes for the workers, so they can buy a house, buy a vacation, send their kids to school. Are they comfortable with the idea of being a capitalist? And when I've asked this question of your students, and I think you've had in the neighborhood of 15 to 20 kids in the class, I've never seen more than 3 or 4 of them raise their hands to say, yes, I am a capitalist. What is your sense of their understanding of what it is they're getting into? That why are they choosing this profession if they don't feel comfortable being a major cog in this thing called capitalism?
Yeah, no, it's a great question when you've asked that. I've watched the faces out there, and I think the students are probably not really understanding what capitalism is. And I think there's a lot of that going on. A lot of the students, we have social justice is such an important thing to this generation, certainly more so than it was to my generation. And that's really where their focus starts. And then after you've asked that question, we have dialogue in our next class to kind of talk about that. And it's like, you realize if you are working on Cheerios, if you are working on a car, whatever, you are a capitalist. That's what we are. That's what we're doing. And then some of them will go, okay, yep, I got it. And then some of them will go, well, maybe I should work on a nonprofit. Maybe that's something that's more. So it kind of, it starts to make them think a whole lot differently. So it's a great question because it hasn't really been approached to them, and their understanding of, if you're an advertising writer or PR, you're capitalist. That's what we're doing, is we're helping businesses, helping brands.
I don't think it's still on the walls of Ogilvy offices around the country. I think it's been taken down. But when I was a young copywriter and I would visit a buddy of mine in Chicago, I started my career in Milwaukee, and I would drive to Chicago and visit friends. And a buddy of mine got a job at Ogilvy in Chicago, and I walked into the office, and the front receptionist, there was a big sign over the reception that says, if it doesn't sell, it's not creative. Or the other one was, we sell or else. And these are quotes that were classic quotes from Ogilvy. I don't know if those are still up there or not. I haven't been to an Ogilvy office in a while. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. But I'm wondering if it's just not hip, if it's not cool. I don't know.
So my experience, has been similar. Like I gave a speech at the Miami Ad School in 2018, and then I kind of dusted it off and gave it to some students from Florida State University's ad club not that long ago. And it's pontifications, right, from like an old fart in advertising. And the first one is, if you're not a capitalist, you probably should consider another career. And I intentionally make it harsh, for them to understand. But I give an anecdote that I think helps them to understand what I mean, and the anecdote was from a creative director, a pretty famous international creative director, who talked about an occasion where he was at the Nestle ice cream plant and they were receiving a brief, and the director of the company asked for the head creative to come with him, and he showed him the room, like where all the workers were making the ice cream, and he said, all these people have jobs. here and we run one shift. And if you do a good campaign, we could add a second shift. And if you do a brilliant campaign, then we'll have 3 shifts of workers. And this is in Argentina, you know, in Latin America, where, you know, good jobs are not necessarily easy to come by. And so he talked about the idea of, you know, advertising being more than what you think it is, and that it helps commerce. And so I always, the way I kind of soften for them at the end is to say, look, capitalism is become a dirty word, but it really is people freely engaged in making something that other people freely decide to buy. I can't think of anything, you know, better, at another system that's better than the people who are working are doing it voluntarily, and the people who are buying the products that they're making are doing that voluntarily with nobody telling them to do it.
Well, we could paraphrase Winston Churchill, who said, capitalism is the worst form of economics on the planet, except for all the others.
Yeah, I think he said that about democracy, but
yes.
we'll
That's why I said it. I paraphrased him.
Yeah. We borrowed it.
So yeah, or I bastardized it, however you want to phrase it, but I mean, the point is still the same. So Mark, I didn't realize that you'd been an adjunct for as long as you were prior to, because you're doing this full time now.
Yes, correct. Yeah.
Are the kids going to make it? Do you think they will do well in the industry based on what you were teaching, what the school is teaching? Do you think they're going to do all right?
Yeah, I think the students we have today are really smart students. I mean, they are smart, they're passionate. I'll give you a little anecdote. I'm a faculty advisor for the National Student Advertising Competition, our club here at the University of Minnesota. We just competed. We were one of 8 schools selected from 120 around the country to go to Nashville for a week at the American Advertising Federation Ad America Conference. Our team finished 5th in the country. We are extremely happy with that. And they won the best team presentation, which means they gave the best presentation in our country for this competition. Our product was MetaQuest 2, right up their alley, the VR headset. And to see those students come together, and I see them in my classes too, but the ability to spend 6-7 months together to put together a program, to present it to professionals multiple times. There's talented people out there, and every school has that. I mean, every school has talented students. And I also teach my 3rd class that I teach is the campaigns course, which is a capstone course. So it's all seniors, they're PR advertising people, and they come together. We work a whole semester on a project, and Howard has a beautiful cat there today.
Yeah, she's the 3rd wheel of the Brief Brothers.
But your question is, I think our students are doing great. I mean, I'm really impressed. I mean, I saw a lot of great students from around the country at that conference. And, it's the best of the best when you get to that level. You're really seeing students that have the capacity, that have the passion to really know what they want to do. And at that point, they know they're in the capitalist world. They have understood this now. They're not, that sophomore, junior still trying to figure it out. So I have high hopes. I really have high hopes for what they can bring, as long as they keep their feet grounded in great strategies. And an idea is an idea. It doesn't matter if it's on TikTok or a print ad. You still got to have a heck of an idea to make it visible to people.
Who are some of the folks that you bring in besides, funny, goofy authors like me? You have other authors whose books they read, and you bring in other experts. And I know you had a strategist from, I forget the agency in Minneapolis, who helped your students with with the Hulu summary, the Oatly summary, and the Bumble summary, which we used as the premise for picking one of those to write our creative brief exercise for.
Yeah.
Who was that? Who was that? Maria?
Yeah. Maria Pezos, give credit to Maria. She is a planning director at Carmichael Lynch here in the Twin Cities. She's originally from Columbia. She is what's called an adjunct diversity fellow. So she comes and talks to my class that planning class 3 times a semester. And because of where we live, Howard, you know this market really well. The Twin Cities is a terrific advertising communications market. So I really draw on all my previous connections. We've got a lot of alumni in the market. So alumni love to come back. One of my, in each class, I have a panel called the Young Professionals Panel. So it's students that have graduated 1 or 2 years ago. And the current students just love that because they can see themselves. It's like, oh, I can see that I can get a job. And, I really try to have a lot of that, but it's a lot of local people. I have one other author. I have Chris from down in Austin, Texas, where Chris Kosak, he wrote account planning guide, and we use that. So, but otherwise, it's a lot of local people, and especially it's been great this year. We're back in person where, previously we were always on Zoom, but it's so good for the students to actually see them and have the chance to interact with them.
Quick question. We didn't talk a lot about your background before teaching, and I'd love to hear more about that. Like, where did you go to school? How was your the journey through the industry?
Okay, well, I'll take up the next 60 minutes with that, Henry. But I got my undergraduate degree at the University of North Dakota. I went immediately to Medill at Northwestern. I got my master's in advertising back then. Now it's integrated marketing communications. I worked at Campbell Methuen for a few years. I went back to Chicago. I worked at Leo Burnett, Foot Cone and Belding. I came back to the Twin Cities, worked at Campbell Methuen. I was a Boomerang, welcome back Cotter member, so I came back. Also worked at Martin Williams and Preston Kelly, now Preston Spire here in the Twin Cities. So, 30.
In what capacity were these strategy planning jobs or account leadership, account director type of jobs?
Yeah, account management, Howard or Henry, is where my background was. But back in those days, we didn't always have strategists. So the management people wrote a lot of the briefs. And even in smaller agencies today, you don't have that discipline of just a planner strategist. So
correct. That's actually how I got into strategy. I was at a small boutique agency and there was no strategy. And I kept asking a lot of why questions, like, why does the client want this? Why are they doing it this way? Why? And eventually I realized that nobody else was asking those questions. So I kind of just created the role of strategist at this agency. And that's how I started. But I have a lot of respect for account people, account management people, particularly, of my age and older, who came up in a time where they had to be the strategist. That was one of the hats that they wore. And it's interesting because planning as its own function is relatively new, but somebody was always doing it, right? Like there is some combination of the account person, the media people. A lot of times had access to research and surveys and data from the TV networks and things like that. So I think just I probably for me, that was one of the big benefits of growing up my first 7 years in the career in a boutique agency where I had to wear a lot of hats. And so I got to dabble in a lot of different areas of agency operation. And I'm not just a guy who graduated college, went directly to become a junior strategist and hasn't really understood what it's like to write copy for an ad or what it's like to resize. When the art director would call in sick, somebody had to resize the ads that day, and you had to learn how to use Quark Express or Photoshop or whatever. And so I was able to empathize with all of these people across the different functions of the agency, which I think has helped me in turn as a strategist to see the big picture.
Yeah, even I'm going way back when I started at Campbell Methuen. They did a really smart thing, is they had us spend several weeks with different departments. And I'll never forget, I started working in the creative department. Peter Hale, our rest in peace, great creative director at Campbell Methuen, had me work, and he didn't care what I was doing. Mark, you're going to contribute. And I'll never forget, they were trying to develop a character for crispy wheats and raisin cereal. And he said, Mark, what would you do? And I said, what would a good name be? I said, well, what about like Seymour? You could Seymour raisins. And it was like, bingo. They took it, made a commercial out of it. And it's like, that made me, and with that creative team, was like, that's a good account person. They have ideas. So I think that's so important to have that understanding of whether it's the media team, research team, project management team, you need to understand what they all do so you can do your job as well as anybody else.
I am sadly encountering quite the opposite attitude in some of the workshops that I'm doing for corporate training, where there's a wider and wider gap between who owns the creative brief. And Henry, in an ad agency situation, it's his turf. But in a lot of client situations where there are no strategists, the marketing department in some companies, and I'm not going to name names, but they're saying, we're going to own the creative brief process and we're going to push the creatives farther and farther outside of the process. We're not going to eliminate them, but we're going to own it. And I come into this training environment with a particular philosophy, which is a lot closer to what Henry's attitude is, in spite of what you might think, Henry. You can't separate the two. Or contrarily, if you're gonna say, as the marketing department, we're gonna own the creative process, then own the damn thing, right? And if it's not working, if you're going round after round after round and not getting what you want, then you got to stop and say, whose fault is that? It's probably ours. We got to fix this. And I'm not hearing them being that way. But sadly, I am seeing this gap widening between the two departments when it should be coming closer together. I go to school on what Henry says a lot. I know he has told me that he's used my books in his situation. And this is a two-way street. I hear so often from Henry that he doesn't spring a brief on his creative department. He goes and talks with his creative director. He gets feedback from his creative director, and that makes his briefs better. You can't not do it that way. So to hear companies saying the marketing is going to own the creative brief process and the creatives are just going to not quite, but almost become order takers, well, you're going to pay a huge price for that.
Yeah.
And you have to kind of prevent that by inculcating the next generation of students about the necessity and importance of,
Yeah, we talk about that a lot. We talk about creative brief writing as a collaborative effort, everybody. This is not one where, to quote from Howard's book, you take the brief and shove it under the creative director's door and run as fast as you can the other way. No, everybody's got to be in it. And I agree with the philosophy that Henry has. And that's certainly what I did when I was a professional. I worked with the creative director. I never showed a creative brief to the entire creative team until we had worked on it together. It was really important. And, his business understanding, I know we got to a lot better SMPs because of his involvement than if we would have just stayed and I just did it myself. But you got to get other people involved. I mean, at the end of the day, somebody has to kind of take charge of it, like Henry takes charge of a brief, but you take input from everybody to make it that much better.
You had some great training grounds by working at Leo Burnett. I mean, they are just a giant in our industry. Not just in terms of the creative, but in the training, because they used to do training back in the day in the 60s and the 70s, just like, J. Walter Thompson and Ogilvy and the big New York agencies. They'd have schools for copywriters, art directors, I'm guessing would be account people and maybe eventually planners. Were you part of that when you were at Leo, or is that already
I did a lot down? At training, actually, at Foot Cone and Belding. Foot Cone and Belding did a summer where they brought in people that had been in the industry 2 to 5 years. And they flew people in, it was in Chicago is where I worked. So we brought people from New York, from Los Angeles, from San Francisco, like 50 people. And they put us through 2 weeks. And I mean, it was 2 weeks of weekends, nights, and it was one of the best experiences I ever had. And Leo Burnett certainly had training, but that was probably the most intense focus I saw. I don't recall the name of it, but it was a Foot Cone business thing that they did that was just terrific. I mean, there's still people from that class that I still have relationships with, because you spent a lot
It's
of
like a
time.
boot. It sounds like a boot camp. Yeah, you
Totally
probably.
was. Totally was, Henry. I mean, even though I lived in Chicago, we had to live in the hotel that everybody else was in. They just made it really, really, and they talked a lot about it. When you go into this, what you're going to come out, you're going to be a changed advertising person because of all the
Yeah,
experiences.
I don't think that anybody does things like that anymore.
No.
And it's a real shame. You mentioned, the Twin Cities being, a really good hub of advertising communication. Chicago, I mean, the names of the agencies that you worked at, I mean, New York gets all the headlines, Madison Avenue is synonymous with advertising, but for my money, Chicago, I think there's a lot going for Chicago in terms of advertising, or historically there was, it being the railroad hub of America,
Mhm.
where a lot of the products, frankly, arrived from the Midwest, where they were manufactured and then would go out to the rest of the country. It made Chicago just an important city in commerce, and also the Midwest sensibility, which is, I think, more in touch with the average American. We've seen this polarization now of the coasts and then the flyover country. And so when you look back at those old ad campaigns from Leo Burnett and the ad characters that they created, that, even before we had a name for it, like mental availability, what's Tony the Tiger more than just something that's lodged in your head? If I tell anybody of a certain age Tony the Tiger, they immediately know what I'm talking about. They immediately know that it's Kellogg's Frosted Flakes. The taste of it probably comes to their mind. And so these things are, so yeah, I think the Midwest in general, and Chicago specifically, was such an important part of, and even, I'm a big fan of the history of advertising, as you could probably guess. And when the Big Bang merger that created basically Omnicom happened, when oh man, I'm having like a lapsus mentis, but when DDB merged
Needham.
with Needham Harper, yeah, Needham Harper was really the acquiring firm. DDB was in decline. Bernbach had been dead for many years. It was Needham Harper that had McDonald's, and the Budweiser business, Midwestern brands that were all American brands. And it was Keith Reinhardt who basically rescued the DDB brand and said, you know what, this isn't about Needham, it's not about Harper, and it's not about me. This is about Bill Bernbach, and we can use that. So you just gave me a little bit of nostalgia for like my DDB days, learning all about Bill Bernbach and
Me too. I got my exposure to DDB though in LA. That was where I worked for a couple of years on the Cigna healthcare account, and I think for about 5 minutes on Wells Fargo. But that was where, and we had some bigwigs from New York come out and talk to us a couple of times. So yeah, it's a Midwestern, attitude and work ethic that I think is so prominent in that part of the country, which is, I think, admirable. But I got my exposure in LA, of all places, interestingly enough.
Yeah, when you mentioned Keith Reinhardt, I mean, he's such a legend in this business, and he wrote a great book called Any Wednesday, which he used to write a memo back in the olden days before the computers, laptops. He'd send a memo to every office in the country on a Wednesday, just talking about various topics. And, it's leaders like that will get good work, because the creative people, the account people that are working for him, they really respect that. But I think so much of him. He is definitely a legend.
So I'm a big fan of his. So one day they told me I needed to fly to New York for a special briefing for McDonald's, and we get there, and briefing us is none other than Keith Reinhardt. He was already retired. He was chairman emeritus of DDB, and he came, basically to tell us everything what he felt about the McDonald's brand. And this was because we were all of the agencies that work on McDonald's were coming up with ideas for the biennial convention. And, lovely guy, talked about the brand passionately. The work that came from that briefing, some of the best work that I've been associated with. But it was funny because about a year later, toward the end of my time at Alma DDB, I was switched and I was working on the State Farm account, another Midwest account in Bloomington, Illinois. And I'm sitting there in the State Farm lobby and waiting for the person to come down and retrieve us to go up to our meeting, when I see a piece of sheet music on the wall framed, and it's the theme song, the jingle for Like a Good Neighbor, State Farm is There. And it says, music by Barry Manilow, lyrics by Keith Reinard.
Yeah.
Wow, there's a piece of history. That's pretty amazing. And I know exactly what you're talking about because I've done a workshop in that office in Illinois, so I know exactly what you're talking about. Mark, let's get back to your classroom, and I don't want to embarrass Henry here, but I think he wrote a pretty darn good brief.
Yep.
And I know the assignment that we gave ourselves didn't dovetail perfectly with your semester. I think it came after your semester ended.
Yeah.
But fill us in a little bit on the three summaries of the brands that you gave us, and we asked. I put out a request on LinkedIn for some help that Henry and I were looking for to do this project, and you and your class stepped up and gave us these. Was this something that you were doing last or spring semester or not? Give us the context for that, for what you gave us, and what's the plan? Are you going to share our brief?
Yeah,
with the
so
students?
here's a little bit of the background on it. So it was their third creative brief assignment in the class, and the first two they worked on a different format. And actually the person that wrote the three summaries was Maria Pazos. I need to give her credit. So Maria is in the classroom. She helps develop that assignment. And we use the Mark Pollard creative brief, which is a very simple brief: problem, consumer, insight, SMP. So I have them learn to do it. So their brief looks a lot different than what.
Now let me just interrupt and say Mark Pollard is the guy who wrote that new book. He's on LinkedIn. He's a sweathead. That's it, sweathead. We want to give him a little credit.
Yeah, absolutely. Terrific guy. And we, a lot of great information, but we use that format. It's a really good one for the students to follow. And we gave it to them probably at the beginning of April. They had the assignment. It was completed in April. So when you reached out, we had probably completed it at that point. And they did a good job with it. They had multiple things to hit. And it's a great process because they kind of understand what a brief can do. We still push them. SMPs is something that they always have to keep working on. I always say SMPs are not taglines, everybody. So I know, like Henry has, what's the headline? I could never give them that brief because I know they would write a headline and not a strategy statement. So I know exactly what Henry's doing, which makes sense for a professional, but for students, we really want to keep them on that SMP front. I hammer that home. That's what we're talking about. It's not a tagline. It's not a.
Don't try this at home without professional supervision.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, actually, the idea of an SMP as a headline comes from Howard's book. And, we talked about how you guys came to know each other, and we've told the story many times, but since I was a self-taught strategist, I was always scouring the internet looking for resources to teach myself. And one day I find this book by a guy named Howard Eibach, and I read it and I digested it like, I don't know, probably in 60 minutes. And so I brought it to my boss, who was a psychologist who had become an advertising strategist. And she said, "Oh, I like this book." She's like, "We should bring him in to teach a workshop." And so Howard came down to Miami, and we kind of just stayed in touch ever since. But yeah, that idea of thinking of it as a headline comes from Howard's book. And for me, it's the question is, it's titled headline, then it says, what's the single most whatever. So it's more traditional. I'm not looking for I'm not trying to generate an actual headline, but figuratively, like if there's a headline and then there's body copy, what is the headline? What's the most important thing that we need?
Yep.
I think the thing to stay away from is to put the pressure on yourself to write it as if it's a tagline. That's what I think you should avoid. Headline is actually a good idea because Sir John Haggerty says the very same thing. Yeah. And I've said this over and over and over again. John Steele quotes him. I don't know if it's in John Haggerty's book. I'll have to check. But John Steele quotes him as saying, what I do is I take the proposition from the brief, I write it down on a blank piece of paper, I put a picture of the product above or below it, I stick that on the wall. And I say, is this a good ad? It doesn't even have to be a great ad. It just, is it a good ad? Is it a good starting point? And if the answer is yes, then I say, okay, now my job as a creative and my teams who I hire and assign to this, our job is to do something better, to make it better. So I think the headline concept, and this is probably what influenced me in my thinking, is a great place to begin because you are writing the first headline. The creative brief is the first step of the creative process. The problem is, and I think Chaz Wigley cited this in his 100 Things He's Learned as a Planner, his blog post on the BBH lab, was that a creative or a strategist who starts to think of his brief as the beginning and the middle and the end, and that's it. Just do my thing. He turns into a fascist, and that's not what we want. It's a starting point. Yeah. Now, creatives, can you do better than that?
Yep.
So I think your warning or your admonition to not think of it as a tagline is the correct way to go. But you still think your students would be a little put off if you asked them to think of it as a headline?
I don't know if they would quite grasp it to know what it is, because they'll think a headline is a tagline to some of them, and they're still understanding those nuances are not there. And I really try to separate the strategy is why we're going to say something, and the execution is how you're going to say it. So when they're dissecting, they're deconstructing ads. I mean, it's an exercise. It's an old Leo Burnett trick. I have them do a convince that because. When you're watching an ad, if you're looking at something, who are they trying to talk to? What are they saying? What's the that? And what's the support? How do you do that? So it's a real strategy shorthand that I hammer home every class period about that. In fact, I have students bring in my campaigns class, they will bring in a content piece of the day. So they're going to bring in a piece, whether it's a video or a print ad or whatever. And then I want them to do a convince that because what's the strategy? And then does it work or does it not work? I don't want you to say if you like it or not. I want you to start to evaluate, does that do the job that it needs to do or does it not?
So that's a nice, easy formula. And I think the key is repetition.
Yes.
Yeah.
And Howard and I have spoken a lot about this. The sad fact is that at 6 o'clock when the whistle blows and everybody goes home, a lot of advertising people go back to just being consumers and not thinking critically about the tons of advertising they're being exposed to. And to me, that's a wasted opportunity, because if you're going to end up watching a YouTube pre-roll ad or whatever it is, watch it with a critical lens of an advertising person, because you're always learning. You're always, usually it's when an ad is really horrible that my spidey senses start tingling, and I'm like, what the F were they thinking on this ad? I might have given this anecdote before on the podcast, but there used to be a billboard here in Miami on I-95, big interstate that is our main interstate. And it was for Mercy Hospital. Local hospital's been here forever. And it was for their maternity. And they had the billboard, it had like some stock photo or something. And then it said, a NICU with a sea view, because Mercy Hospital is on the bay. And I thought, what are they, if you have a complication with your childbirth and your child is in a NICU, the last thing you care about is the view of the bay. Now, if one of the benefits of the hospital is a serene environment that, you know, you're going to look out your window and it's very peaceful. That's fine. And that could be a very good thing for maternity generically, but not for the NICU. Like those two things. So, and so it's those things that like I see and I'm like, what the fuck were they thinking when they did this? What was possibly, so I think that your formula, you know, those three things is really, but the key is repetition, doing it all the time with every piece of content that you come into contact with.
I think it was Rob Swartz, who I think you both know. I think he came
my former boss.
Yeah. I read something, he said, you need to be an ad nerd in this business. And I really stress that with the students. It's exactly what Henry just said, is when you see something, you got to analyze it. You know, I know you're not going to do it 24 hours a day, but
and
really,
you don't need to.
No, just get in the practice of understanding why somebody's saying what they're saying. And, you know, does it work or does it not work? You need to understand that, whether you're a creative person, a strategist, a account person, you got to know, is the advertising effective?
I say this all the time. I say this all the time. My dad's a cosmetic surgeon. I couldn't imagine him taking a trip to the beach and not looking at the people and wondering who did their work and what was wrong with them. And, you know,
that's good. That's good.
And you know, you only do this. I say this in my workshops, just take 3 minutes. You're sitting in the dentist office, you're driving home, you see a billboard, you're flipping through a magazine, you're going through Instagram, you see an ad, just take 3 minutes and ask 2 or 3 questions that you might encounter on a brief. Can I figure out an insight? That might be one of the harder ones, but you know, test yourself.
Who's this for? Like
talking to Mark's
point,
this for? Right. And you do this every day, it becomes a habit, and you start training your brain to think like a creative brief writer. Even if all you do is review a creative brief for someone else or contribute a thought, but you want to build this into a habit. So, you know, Henry is absolutely right. We turn off our brains. Yeah. There's a sociologist have a phrase for it, and I can't think of it off the top of my head. But again, going back to Chaz Wigley and his thing for BBH, he has one that's similar to it, and I've got it in a little sticky note on my desktop. That's how important it is. He has a get to buy simple statement. Get, and he used in our conversation. He used the conversation. What did the Brits do to get the United States into World War II? Get what? Get the United States to do what? To enter World War II as our ally by doing what? Wooing FDR. No. And that's what Churchill did so well. He was great at with his long letters, and that's a strategy statement that's really similar to yours. Was what? Convince that because. Well, Henry's point is dead on. Whatever formula you use, it's drill it in, do it over and over and over, so it becomes second nature. Yeah. So that leads me to another question. When your students take your class, do they come in with an idea? I'm going to be a copywriter. I'm going to be an art director. I want to be a strategist. I want to be an account person. Or where are they when they come into your class?
A lot of them, I wish more of them knew exactly where they were going, but a lot of them don't at that point. And each one of my classes, in the second lecture, I go through the steps of here's the different places in the agency. Because a lot of them don't know what production is. They don't know what traffic is. They've maybe heard of creative, maybe media, maybe account. They don't even, strategist is still a kind of a term that they don't really understand. So I really spend time grounding them in that. And it is amazing. At the end of the semester, I have each student do a reflection. I call it the top 10 things, ripping off from David Letterman, top 10 things you learn in this class. And it is amazing how many, when they take the account planning class, had never thought of that as an area that they want to go into. And then they went, oh God, I love this strategy thing. That's exactly what I want. So they're coming into it not really knowing, and hopefully at the end of the classes, they're having a little better picture. I think creative people are probably the ones that that know the easiest. I want to be a designer. I want to be a writer. They have it, but more the account people, the strategists, media people are still kind of squishy for exactly what that is. And that's okay. I mean, nobody needs to know exactly what they're doing at age 19 or 20. So just expose yourself to as many things as possible. And that's what I really try to do. I think as an agency person, that's what I can bring into the school, into the classroom, is real life experience of here's what works in an agency. And you know, the students love that. The faculty that have that agency experience, they love that because they know you've done it and you understand it. So it's easy to teach from that perspective.
I love what you said about not needing to know what you're going to do at 19. You know, I got an economics degree at 21. My life took a couple of detours, and I didn't walk into an ad agency for the first time until I was 25 years old. And here I am 26 years later. On my 25th anniversary, I sent a text to my mentor, who was the guy that gave me the first job. I said, 25 years ago today, I walked into an ad agency for the first time because of you. And his answer was, "Will you ever forgive me?" and of course it's a joke, but it's been a good career with a lot of downs, but certainly a lot of ups, and it's been fruitful and rewarding financially, and it's better than real work. It's better than breaking rocks or paving roads or whatever. So I agree. I think we put too much pressure on young people to plan their whole futures in advance. It's sometimes we think about obviously the high rates of divorce that exist, and we lament it, and it's understandable to lament it, but it's a different era. It's not that you're going to live to be 45. You meet somebody at 20, what are the chances that you're going to be able to coexist with that person for 60 years? It's a lot more challenging. So to make a long-term commitment like a career at that early age before you've been exposed to anything is really difficult. So I think a well-rounded education where you learn how to think, how to solve problems, how to work with teams and collaborate, I think is more valuable than any. I can't remember a single lesson from college, but I remember that it was a time where I grew as a person.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. You got to make people think in this business. You got to help them understand how to solve problems, and they got to collaborate. This is not a business of lone wolves. I talk about that a lot. You have got to work with a lot of people. And then going back to your story about, I think I talk about this in my class, and I might get the year wrong, but David Ogilvy didn't start Ogilvy and Mather and really work in the advertising business until his mid-30s. He
was like a chef or something.
Exactly. He was doing research. He was doing research and stuff, not advertising. And he did pretty well, I think, at 35, didn't he?
Yeah, you gotta find.
See, this is the thing. We have it backwards in our industry. We focus on the young, and we push out the people when they become really good at it. Like Henry, I didn't start my first job until I was almost 30. 2 months shy of my 30th birthday, I got my first copywriting job, and I basically ended my career in 2012, which would have been 10 years ago. So I was 55, because I'm 65 now, maybe 54. And just what I'm really getting good at, knowing how to do this and doing it quickly. I could snap out headlines and ideas a dozen at a time when, because the machine was well oiled. All of a sudden you lose traction in the industry. And that's exactly the opposite. I don't know if you follow George Tannenbaum on LinkedIn. George is actually doing really, really well. We had him on as a guest. He's doing a hell of a lot better today than he ever was when he was working at Ogilvy and other shops, because he's charging 3 or 4 times what he was making, because he's good and he can crank out this stuff, and he knows what we're talking about. So here's a chance for me to ask you, Mark, what advice would you give to the powers that be out in the advertising agency world to open their eyes about what young people aspire to, what they're good at, what they can do, what they can accomplish, and what they maybe should do to prepare them, these young people, for the industry they're going to enter.
Well, I think it goes back to, I think Henry was talking about this, about the training. And I think agencies, and I did a lot of training at the agencies I worked at, and it wasn't enough. I mean, I look back at it and I go, you know, I remember, I always give students the thing, when I got handed my first creative brief to write as a young assistant account executive on General Mills at Campbell Methuen, they gave me a form and said, go at it. And I was like, well, I didn't know how to write briefs. And you've got to train people, whether it's writing briefs, whether it's, you know, writing a marketing plan, whether it's writing a research plan. More agencies need to spend time training the younger people. The younger people are coming in, they're eager, they want to learn, but they need some guardrails. They can't just go off into the corner and make beautiful stuff without having a lot of input. And that input, you know, comes from their supervisors. I mean, the people that start off in their career that have great supervisors, great mentors, mentees, together can really create that. So I always, you know, I'm a big proponent of training, whether it was when I was in the business and certainly now when I'm in school. And the ability to, you know, listen to various things. I mean, listening to your podcasts, those are educational elements that you should do. I mean, you need to listen to things. You need to get content. George Tannenbaum, he wrote something when he was 60 things I learned in the business, and I'm 60 or whatever. I give that to my campaigns class. We go through 5 of them each class period. And
That's
it's great things. The lessons that are out there, there's so much information available. I'm an information junkie, like I think both of you are, and there is so much stuff. But you gotta get in there and be that ad nerd. You've really got to get in there to be successful. And, you know, I think agency people at the higher levels have got to get training more to the forefront. So we have the Burnett's and the Ogilvy's and the foot cone training programs. You know, maybe they can't get to that level, but get access, bring people in, bring speakers in. It's so easy. Like you said, you went and spoke at Henry's agency. Bring people in. That's such an important thing to do, to get outside perspectives. Because if you keep everything within the 4 walls of your agency, you're missing an awful lot of stuff that's out there. And
yeah,
that's the blinders that a lot of people have, is they just think, well, we're just going to talk about it this way. No, you need to bring in person A, because they're going to give you a different perspective.
Mark Jenson, lecturer at the University of Minnesota's Hubbard School of Journalism and Mass Communications. Thank you for joining us today.
So that's how I used to end every online class period with my students. So I thought, oh, that's down here, I'm going to say that to you. But thanks.
All right. Good stuff, Henry.
Good stuff, Howard.
He's Henry Gomez.
And he's Howard Eibach. And together we're the Brief Brothers. Till next time, bye-bye.
Bye.